Thank you for coming to our first event of the year. My name is Jakob Muratov, and this is my first panel event at the think tank. Just a little information about the organization. The King's Think Tank is the largest student-led policy institute in Europe, and we have 7 different policy institutes that focus on current problems in the world. So, how do we start? How can we contextualize this overwhelming movement of people across Europe? How do we come about the hundreds of thousands of refugees and migrants coming from Syria, Afghanistan, Eritrea, Iraq, and many other countries escaping poverty and war? Who does Europe turn to? Some countries like Germany and Sweden have advocated an open door policy, but gravely underestimated the capacity of their country's infrastructure. Reinforcing borders and sending people back seem to be one of the short-term solutions that Hungary and Slovakia have started. Even the 120,000 relocation scheme spearheaded by the EU Commission is not enough. British politicians pride themselves on being one of the highest overseas development contributors, but only support a relocation scheme program for a fraction of the population in refugee camps neighboring Syria. Underlying all of this is the lack of a collective long-term strategy. Today, our distinguished guests come from the academic, political, and media sphere. Dr. Jeff Crisp is a research associate at the University of Oxford's Refugee Studies Centre. He was previously head of policy development at the UNHCR and worked in senior positions at the Refugees International and the Global Commission on International Migration. Dr. Crisp has first-hand experience of humanitarian operations in more than 60 countries around the world. In May 2013, he led an evaluation mission to examine the international response to the Syrian refugee crisis in Jordan, Lebanon, and Iraq. Jean Lambert has been the Green MEP for London since 1999. She's been a vocal advocate for refugee rights, and during her time as MEP has worked actively on issues of asylum and refugees as a member of the Employment and Social Affairs Committee. She's also the Green Party's immigration spokesperson. Mr. James Mates is the Europe editor and newscaster for ITV News. He covered the refugee crisis in former Yugoslavia, the uprising in Chechnya, and the Rwandan genocide. His extensive knowledge and reporting has led him to winning multiple awards, including a silver medal from the Film and Television Festival in New York and title of senior correspondent at ITV. Just yesterday, he was in Brussels to report on the Council Summit and the enduring problem of refugees. Now, concerning the structure, we will have a 1-hour panel discussion on the migrants themselves, the borders, and the response needed to overcome the crisis. We'll end with a 30-minute Q&A session. Feel free to use the hashtag #KTTRefugeeCrisis and tagging us at King's Think Tank. So my first question is, how do we distinguish between economic migrants and asylum seekers? And is it even necessary to do so? After all, most of them are escaping extreme poverty and oppression. Should we start with you, Mr. Kirk?
Yeah, okay, well, the question has been raised, particularly in the right-wing media, as to whether all of the people making their way into Europe are actually refugees or whether they come under some other status, particularly economic migrants. And I'm certainly not going to try and argue that 100% of the people who have arrived in Europe over the past few months are necessarily refugees. But I think if we just take a look at the countries you've already mentioned, Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Eritrea, and I would also add to that list Somalia, I think the latest figures show that around 75% of new arrivals come from those countries. And those countries are what we call refugee-producing countries, in the sense that they are countries affected by armed conflict, instability, and acute human rights violations. So there's one can presuppose that a large number of them are indeed refugees. You've asked the question as to how do we tell whether somebody is a refugee or not. There is a 1951 UN Refugee Convention to which all the European member states are signatories, which sets out the definition of a refugee as somebody who has a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, political opinion, nationality, or membership of a particular social group. And that is the standard definition that all governments use in order to kind of test the case of individual asylum seekers. We have something called refugee status determination, which is a very detailed look at each individual application, looking at what's happening in the country of origin, trying to verify that person's story to see whether it can be confirmed that they are in need of international protection. clearly, when such large numbers of people cross borders as they have been recently, then such individual status determination is simply not possible. And so refugees are recognised on what we call a prima facie basis. In other words, if you're coming from a country which, as I've just said, is affected by conflict and human rights violations, then people are accepted in, pending, perhaps later on, a more detailed examination of their individual case. So my argument would be that most of the people arriving do have a good and well-founded claim for refugee status, and that there are mechanisms that allow us in the longer term to differentiate between people who are in need of protection and people who are not in need of protection.
Okay. Jean, what do you think? What about people from Macedonia and Serbia? There is also poverty there. Do you think that these people should also be accepted, or what's your take on that?
Well, I think the key to it is the status determination, and that there's a growing talk about sort of the use of so-called safe third countries, and you're seeing a move, I think, from the European Union to sort of label certain countries, certain border countries, accession countries, as safe third countries. And part of that is, I think because there has been movement across border from some of these, particularly people, a number of them from Roma background and so on, so people feeling that, this has almost been trying to cope with that anyway, and a lot of those have not actually met the criteria under EU legislation, but either for refugee status or subsidiary protection. The European Union works with both slightly different criteria. So, so what you're seeing at the moment, though, is this use of sort of safe third country as a way to say sort of, whoa, not everybody here. Because if it's a safe third country at the border, you can say, well, okay, you stay there and they will deal with your status determination. So that's part of it in terms of what's happening there. But even then, the criterion has to be that somebody who lodges an application for asylum is, their application should be determined. You cannot assume that every country is safe for everybody. That even those countries which are now looking at, being seen as safe third countries around the border, as it were, you will still find even there a small number of people do actually, gain refugee status, even at present. So that's one of the things that you're seeing for some of those particular countries. But I think part of what we're seeing at the moment is this almost a clinging on to trying to keep the systems that we have, and in some countries they're relatively new. Some countries that have never really had a sort of an asylum system before they joined the European Union, but trying to sort of carry on working with people sort of coming in to claim asylum as if it was still normal. So they're still trying to do a status determination instead of, as was being said, sort of saying, well, we first of all we say, yes, you're here, then we'll deal with your claims as and when we can get to them, but first we offer protection. And it's true that in terms of, thank you, is it on? Yeah. Years in classroom. I lost my thread there. That you put a microphone in my hand, I want to sing, and that's not a good idea for anybody. But that you are seeing at the moment, as I say, that this sort of desire to try and carry on keeping to the rules that are on the statute books at a point where they can't particularly work.
But do you think that adding these safe countries onto the list of European, so the safe zone, is that actually helping the situation, though, putting the responsibilities on other countries? I mean, given that the safe countries that are being written down into this list, they're not necessarily as well developed as other EU member states.
Well, I mean, and one of the examples of that, I think, is that if you were Kurdish, you'd left Syria because of the attacks on Kobane or wherever, you're in Turkey at the moment, I don't know how safe you'd feel in Turkey as a Kurd coming from Syria at the moment. So I think that the use of the suddenly sort of bringing into play the safe third country line for countries such as Turkey and 3 or 4 others is a way of buck passing. For those who are in need of protection, a lot of them will already have crossed a number of borders. They are not going to be deterred, from coming to the European Union simply because people say they should be in Serbia or wherever else. The problem comes is if we then get into the business of returning people to Serbia that doesn't have a reasonable system in place, you're not actually meeting the needs of the person in need of protection. You're putting in place a whole set of other things to try and pretend your system is working, when actually you need to be investing in the system and trying to deal with the people that you have in front of you as best you can.
Okay. Well, James, I have a question to you concerning groups that are coming in. So certain countries and groups are advocating to pick and choose migrants based on their religion. For example, Slovenia has just said that it'll only accept Christian refugees. So do you think a sectarian response to this is justified?
No, clearly not. But I think there is also an element there of pointing to particular persecution of certain communities, of whom some Christians in the Middle East undoubtedly would fall into that category. So I don't think one wants to necessarily consider that considerations like that are purely sectarian. They may well have a very well-founded basis. Anecdotally, and I speak anecdotally, but having spent many weeks in the countries of the Balkans and Central Europe with refugees as they cross the borders of Hungary and Slovenia and Serbia and Croatia and Austria and Germany, and having spoken to a great number of them, the Germans estimate that probably 40% of those crossing their borders are actually from the Balkans. And they do anticipate sending those back on the basis that possibly from Kosovo you might have a case, but from other countries you probably don't. And I think that's probably not an unreasonable estimate. There is the problem that when you confuse people who are defined as economic migrants, rightly or wrongly, with people who are clearly refugees, that you can undermine the system for dealing with the refugees. When you have a system there where you have I met many people who told me they were Syrian who spoke not a word of Arabic. Now, I'm not saying they necessarily weren't, but there is clearly a suspicion there that we're all Syrians now, and that in the light of the Swedish commitment that all Syrians will get asylum, and that
well, a lot of them are actually throwing off their passports when they get on the.
That you have seen and heard reports about that, and I can confirm it.
How can you find out who is an actual refugee and not? How can you?
That is one of the problems, and what makes that a much bigger issue, in my mind, talking to people in Germany as I was this week, is that it is diluting and undermining the acceptance of the need to have a generous and open response to those fleeing war and persecution genuinely. They are happy to accept and welcome people fleeing war in Syria. They are less happy to welcome people from Pakistan or Bangladesh or Sub-Saharan Africa or the Balkans who they believe to be economic migrants. However you define the difference between them, in people's minds, in functioning democracies, there is, that is a factor that has to be taken into account. I have to say, most of the communication I get on social media from people who watch our bulletins is about the particular issue of, do you refer to them as refugees or as migrants or as economic migrants? We are thrashing around trying to work out policy on that, and I fudge it by talking about refugees, among whom there are some economic migrants, at the beginning of a report, and then tend to call them refugees after that. And I do that on the basis, and this is how I'd always defend this, that everyone has a right to be treated as a refugee until proven otherwise. I think that is when you turn up and ask for asylum, you have a right to have your asylum application considered, and therefore on that basis, even if they aren't all going to end up winning refugee status, that a priori they should be treated as refugees, which is one of the issues that people have had with the Hungarians.
So then why, for example, if, according to what you say about treating the refugees as all of them before you find out about their true background, then why are we not dealing with a Calais crisis as if they're all refugees and processing them faster?
Well, that ties into the Dublin rules, and that we are legalistic about the Dublin rules and saying we're very happy to treat anyone as a refugee who has turned up in the country and asked for asylum. But if they're in someone else's country, then they must ask for asylum there. And it's slightly disingenuous, of course, because surrounded by water, we can do that very easily until the French start sending them through the tunnel afterwards, which may well happen, I might add, because they're deeply fed up with British policy on that, because they can see it for what it is, that they can't get to Britain, and therefore they can't ask for asylum, however genuine their asylum claim may be. But that is the Dublin rules that Jean was talking about, which are simply not fit for purpose in the current state of this crisis.
Jeff, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think while we're talking about the refugees themselves, we should probably introduce the question as to why these people are moving on from the countries that have offered asylum in the first place, particularly from Turkey. And my own perspective on that would be that in general, refugees, whether they've gone to Turkey, to Lebanon, to northern Iraq, or Jordan, are in relatively safe circumstances. They've certainly found a degree of protection in the countries of first asylum, which obviously they didn't have within Syria, and that's the very reason they left. But many of them, particularly those in Turkey, are choosing now to move on through into Greece and then to other parts of Europe. Why exactly is that? Are they attracted by our amazing social welfare benefits, for example? I don't think so. I think from my conversations with the refugees, it's sheer desperation about the absence of any real future for them and their families. The war is intensifying in Syria. Even if it comes to an end, the level of destruction is going to be so great that early returns to the country are going to be quite difficult. Levels of humanitarian assistance are actually declining as the crisis persists. Refugees in Turkey, for example, and most of the other countries that have offered them asylum don't have a right to work. They can only work in the informal sector. Often that means sending out their kids to go and work and earn a few pennies a week or a day in the informal sector, often working in dangerous and difficult circumstances, and taking kids out of school for the very purpose of putting them into the labour market. So from my perspective and the conversations I've had with the refugees, they just feel there's no future for them in a country like Turkey, and the only alternative is for them to move on.
Jean, my question is another question concerning the refugees themselves, while we still have time. Why? I know that the British public, at least, they were very supportive in September in terms of bringing in more refugees from Europe. Why is it that the government decided to choose only from the refugee camps? Why isn't it working more towards relieving the pressures within the EU? I mean, wouldn't that be a good sign to our EU partners?
Yes, it would be a very good sign of solidarity, and particularly when you want your European partners to be offering some solidarity back in terms of whatever the reforms are that the government is after this week, ahead of sort of the referendum. On the other hand, the government is also in a situation where it's put this arbitrary cap on the net number of people coming into the country. And so they've got themselves in this bind, I think, where by putting that arbitrary cap in a while back and not recognising, I mean, let's set aside free movement from the European Union. I don't want to, I'm not in one of those, but even if we leave the figures there out of it, that you can never predict the number of people who will be coming to your country to seek asylum. I mean, you just can't do that given the state of the world. So that was always going to be something that fluctuated. And I think, not to make that clear to people, that at times you will be asked for a humanitarian response, which may mean that, even if you've got a number in place as the maximum number of net migration you want, you will need to respond to that in terms of the humanitarian response, but also the legal response you have. You're a party to the Geneva Convention. You are actually bound by some of the European Union law on asylum.
But we're not unique in setting a number, though.
No, as far as I'm aware, that number it's unusual.
Well, we're 20,000. France is 24,000.
No, I'm talking about
Spain's 20,000.
I'm talking about the 100,000 immigration cap that the government has put in place in terms of net immigration. to the country.
Target, you mean?
The target, well,
Target, yes.
whatever.
Yeah.
You know, that this figure means that they then get trapped by actually sort of being, every time that they want to offer more, even if they wanted to, you then get attacked for, hang on, you said you were only going to have, what are you doing bringing these people in? You have said that it's a real pressure. Theresa May the other week talking about it, a pressure on social cohesion, etc. So they almost get themselves trapped in their own rhetoric, whatever they then want to do. They've also made the argument that support in the region is extremely important, and so are one of the two biggest donors in terms of money going into support in Lebanon, Turkey, etc. And that's a very good thing, you know, to actually offer that support there, and other EU member states should be stepping up on that. But it's not a substitute for taking people in here. And the number that they took under the resettlement scheme, which was not part of the UNHCR formal resettlement scheme, it hasn't been coordinated with the European Union. You know, with just over a couple of hundred people over the last few years, I think, you know, others may have a different view. My view is that was absolutely shameful, and that the only reason they've been pushed now to the number that they're looking at taking over the next 2 years has been because there's been this massive demonstration of public support. Now they've got to make it work, and that's also about the resources that you put in at the local level and so on and so forth. But I think they could certainly be offering more, and we have a lot of experience here. You know, we already do some level of resettlement. You know, we've got that we can build on, and part of it is about being willing to make the case with the public about why you're doing this, and this has been a point where there's been that public voice. So I think they've got themselves caught up in the policies, their other wider immigration policy. Others may have different views.
I certainly wouldn't disagree with you, but I think without in any way wanting to defend British government policy, there is intense frustration in London, but also in many other European capitals, with the way policy has developed since Angela Merkel made her big promise on September the 4th, which was made on a Friday night apparently in discussion with no one, and has caused very many problems. Number one is the pull factor of actually persuading people to leave either relatively middle class and safe homes in Damascus, I use the word relatively, or from camps to make a perilous journey. But the other point is that what she did was made this strange promise in which she half got rid of Dublin, but only half. So she said that the Dublin rules must still apply. And the Dublin rules, in case anyone's not aware of them, are that you must apply for asylum and have your asylum application processed in the country in which you first arrived in the European Union, which for most people would either be Greece or Italy. Now this was obviously being widely ignored because the Greeks and Italians couldn't handle it, and people were sort of being shoveled on all across the border. In an organised fashion by the Greeks, in a slightly more haphazard but nonetheless extensive fashion by the Italians as well. So what Angela Merkel said was, the Dublin rules must still apply. You must still be processed and fingerprinted in the country in which you arrive. But if you manage to evade this on your way to Germany and get to Germany without having made a Dublin-based application in another country, we will then accept your application in Germany. And you see this, I saw this week in Passau, where 5,000 a day are coming in. And the first thing they do, they take them off the train and they take them to a big tent where everybody is fingerprinted. So I said to them, what's the point of this fingerprinting? What are you going to do? He said, this links immediately, and normally within 5 minutes, or sometimes within an hour if connections are slow, to the central Frontex database on fingerprinting. On asylum applications. So these fingerprints will go right across anyone who has made an application anywhere in the EU. And if you have already made one and your fingerprints are on file somewhere else, you will be sent back to that country, unless certain exceptional circumstances, or unless you're under 18. So we have this situation in which there is now this game going on, where thousands of people are trying to get to Germany without at any point being processed on the way, which means what I saw in Hungary, in Croatia, in Slovenia, is that any offer or attempt by the authorities there to help people, to accommodate them, they would you had thousands of people sleeping on the side of the motorway. The weather, fortunately, was quite good. This was in September, and they would bring up buses and say, look, get in the bus, we'll take you to somewhere where you can sleep in shelter tonight, and then we're arranging to get you to Germany. They wouldn't get in the bus. They didn't believe that somewhere along that way they weren't going to end up processed, and thus their arrival in the promised land was not going to be scuppered by being on file somewhere else. And this all came out of the original Angela Merkel somewhat ill thought out promise of 4th of September. And that is at the root of a lot of the frustration that exists, particularly in Eastern Europe, but in Paris and Rome as well, and in London. And I think is in some part responsible for the very uncoordinated response that you're seeing in Europe, and the fact that London's decided to go on its own. I don't offer that as any form of excuse or justification, just as background to what's happened.
Just a couple of comments. James mentioned Frontex, the European Border Agency, a few minutes ago. Frontex has been putting out the figure that 700,000 people from outside Europe have entered the European Union in the first 9 months of this year. And I just wanted to point out that 3 days ago it came to light that this in fact was a completely false figure, and it's 700,000 border crossings, not 700,000 new arrivals in Europe. So if a single refugee or asylum seeker crosses 3 or 4 borders, then it's counted 4 times. So the actual number of physical individual people crossing the borders is significantly less than the figure of 700,000, which I think has alarmed a lot of people. It also puts into historical perspective the fact that this is not the largest influx in Europe since the Second World War, which is what a lot of people have been saying. Because if you look at the figures during the Balkans War, during the war in Yugoslavia, the numbers were actually much greater. So we're not dealing with a totally unprecedented situation, although the speed is particularly striking in this particular instance. On the question of resettling from refugee camps in the region, the UK government has made it very clear that it's not going to resettle refugees from countries such as Italy or Greece, but will, as my colleagues have just said, will select individual refugees or refugee families from surrounding countries. But they keep saying, I mean, I've heard David Cameron and Theresa May say this many, many times, we will be taking refugees from refugee camps. Well, the fact of the matter is 85% of the refugees in the Middle East, the Syrian refugees, are not living in camps, they're living in host communities amongst the population. So even on that basic fact, I mean, I think there's a bit of disinformation going on. But just going on from that, I mean, what I see reading Theresa May's speech quite closely is a kind of a push in the direction of what I would call an Australian system, which divides up refugees into so-called good refugees and bad asylum seekers. The good refugees are people who go to the next door country, wait there for years, maybe forever, in order to be selected for resettlement. They're the good guys. The bad guys are those who actually make their own decision to move and try and find a solution for themselves. And you're probably aware of Australian policy, which is really punitive towards people who try to make it to Australia under their own devices. And I think reading the Theresa May speech, there seems to be some intention of moving in that direction ourselves.
Is the microphone working? Hello? People are having trouble hearing.
I think, yeah, if we just speak up a bit.
Okay.
But we'll move on to the issues of borders. So Hungary, Slovenia and Germany have introduced border controls. And a lot of people saying that this is the end of the Schengen agreement as we know it. What are your thoughts on that? What do you think? Is this the end of the, crown jewel in what the European project was supposed to be? Anyone can start. Yeah.
I certainly think it has that potential. The Germans have extended their border controls on the border with Austria. They did that yesterday for another 20 days. They've been in place for more than a month already. And certainly talking to police and border staff down there, they cannot see that border control being lifted at any time. You have 5,000 people a day at one particular entry point coming through. And to do that without just to reopen the border and allow them to cross and wander off is not about to happen. I think the key determinant will be the degree to which ill feeling continues to be generated amongst European countries. The attempt to enforce quotas for distributing people, the big problem with that is not getting countries to accept them, though that is a major problem. The big problem with that is going to be persuading refugees to go to countries they don't want to go to. We were invited on just last Friday night to Rome to see a showpiece of Eritrean refugees who were going to be taken as part of a quota to Sweden. Before the cameras got there, half of them had absconded, the other half had to be locked in overnight to make sure they were still there the next day. They didn't want to go. We've seen the same thing now with refugees being moved, an attempt to move some refugees from Greece to Luxembourg, which seems to have outraged Jean-Claude Juncker because he can't see what the problem we're going to Luxembourg is, and indeed nor can I. But they didn't want to go to Luxembourg. Now, if you, in a border-free Europe, if you can, I suppose, distribute people according to the quotas, but will they stay there? It seems improbable. Certainly you will have seen the pictures, you will have heard the people chanting Germany, Germany. The only place anybody that I met wanted to go was Germany. Most of them are going there, and redistributing them within a Schengen zone will be very, very difficult. And all of this, I think, will put tremendous pressure on Schengen, which is already creaking, to put it mildly.
So do we give more money to Germany then, just for them to accommodate them, or should we just end with the relocation scheme to countries that they clearly don't want to be in?
But I think the problem goes much further than money. The problem is assimilation as well.
Yeah.
That's right.
To come.
Yeah, if you could just raise your voice.
Okay, so.
That's much
Right. You basically have to chew the mic, I think, is what it comes down to. I think the part of what is happening here is that yes, I agree that Schengen in some places looks as if it's in difficulty, and I think, however, whether that is permanent or not also depends how it's going to affect business communities. And if business starts to feel that this is getting in the way of trade, that this is a real problem there, then there'll be some pressure coming the other way to open up again. And that certainly at the moment the Commission is doing what it can to look at the cases to push the member states back to, you have the right for temporary closures of borders under Schengen if you're under pressure or it's a security threat, but this idea that somehow these are going to be sitting there for a while, there will be a real pushback from the Commission for what that is worth. And I think it's quite interesting in the whole of this crisis where, that the Commission is actually doing what it can and is coming up with proposals, and it's doing what member states have said that it ought to have been doing for ages, and then the barrier comes where the member states say, well, yes, we asked you to do that, but actually we don't like it. And, our public don't like it, and we're not really prepared to engage in this. But I think the question about the whole sort of relocation scheme within the European Union and moving people on is back exactly to the question that Jeff raised, which is about where people see their future within this. And I think this is part of the real problem here. That if people, are people even prepared to stop to get the information about what this means, what the implications are, etc. And certainly I think a lot of member states have been really poorly prepared to actually even hand out the basic information that they are supposed to have in a variety of languages. That the very fact that the Hungarians knew this was going on didn't even have information there in languages which, according to the legislation, people understand or can reasonably be expected to understand, I think is negligent, to put it mildly. But the bigger issue is, where's your future? Where do you think the future lies for your family? And the fact that people feel that under the Dublin system, you end up being trapped somewhere where you don't want to be, you don't understand it, you may never even have heard of this country. And this is your one chance to actually get some safety for yourself, an opportunity for a livelihood, and if you've got kids, an opportunity for their education. So I think there are some very serious questions here that the European Union has to ask in terms of, a lot of people are now saying Dublin's not fit for purpose. Some of us said it wasn't fit for purpose before it was introduced. How are they going to change that?
But Jean-Claude Juncker himself
Yeah.
dismissed that prospect. Just yesterday, on this issue of
Yeah.
going to Luxembourg, he said very clearly, being a refugee does not give you a right to choose where you want to live.
Well,
So
in that case, Jean-Claude Juncker also has to understand that, okay, it may not give you a choice formally where to live, but people will make that choice.
That is so.
And that if they end up somewhere then, you know, potentially destitute and without a settled immigration status, you know, which certainly, you know, refugee status or subsidiary protection gives you, then you are ending up with another problem, a bigger social problem in many respects. So, I mean, there's a very big voice now coming from the European Parliament about the need to change Dublin, to look at it, and certainly some of the issues coming in are what are the elements either of choice within Dublin or of, you know, that people have some sort of say, some sort of preference where they go, or some form of mutual recognition of refugee status, so that at least people feel they are not stuck in the country that they happen to come to first. And, you know, that's not going to necessarily help the situation in, you know, the immediate moment, but it's certainly part of the thinking that needs to be going on. And the proposals at the moment this week for Dublin were that we add on a sort of a mechanism, a binding mechanism for Dublin, you know, a relocation mechanism to it. That by itself doesn't stand a hope of working on the ground unless people feel they actually have some degree of agency, of choice about their future, and that then fits with the questions all about integration, you know, opportunities on the labour market, all of this.
Yeah, just a couple of points. On the relocation initiative, I mean, I think in principle it's a great idea. It's all about cooperation, it's about responsibility sharing, which is exactly what the refugee regime is supposed to be all about. Like James, you know, I have some fairly serious reservations about how it might function in practice. You know, that whole idea of sending people to countries that don't really want them to be there and sending the refugees to countries they don't want to go to themselves, I think that's potentially storing up problems for the future. And I think we've seen examples of this in the past at a national level rather than international level. So, for example, in Sweden had made an effort in the past to try and make sure that refugees spread out throughout the whole country rather than congregating in the main cities such as Stockholm, and so it spread them out around the country, made social welfare benefits and accommodation and housing and other benefits dependent and conditional on people remaining in the places they were relocated to. But even so, a lot of people drifted back to the major cities because they wanted to be with their friends, their relatives, their compatriots. And so I think, you know, human agency and refugee agency in this instance is going to kind of scupper the very neat plans that are made up in capital cities. In terms of Schengen and Dublin, I was talking to a fairly senior European Commission official earlier this week. He was very explicit about Dublin. He said Dublin is dead, but he said we can never admit that Schengen is dead. You know, it's such a central part of the European project, freedom of movement. I mean, Dublin is a much more technical thing related specifically to asylum seekers, but Schengen is about what the EU as an entity is.
But Schengen doesn't undermine freedom of movement. I mean, border-free Europe and freedom of movement are compatible.
Yeah.
Not incompatible. In that there are countries in the EU for which there is full freedom of movement, but which are not in Schengen.
Do you think Schengen will be withdrawn or
I think it's in big trouble. But the reimposition of border control simply takes us back, 10 or 15 years before Schengen, when the founding principle of freedom of movement and freedom of labour was still in existence.
Thank you for that. I think we'll move on to our last theme, given that we're a bit tight on time. It's about the type of response needed. So my question is, what solutions are needed to tackle the problem in Europe and the problem at source? So would like to start?
Well, I think in answering this question, it's very easy to fall into platitudes. So yes. I'm going to fall into a few platitudes immediately. I mean, clearly and obviously, if we're talking about Syria or even the other countries of origin that have been mentioned, Afghanistan, Iraq, Eritrea, Somalia, I mean, clearly what is missing is any kind of meaningful peace process in Syria. So, you know, the UN Security Council was established to, in the words of the UN Charter, save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. It was the kind of principal peace and security mechanism put in place after the end of the Second World War. Now we've got a situation where 4 of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council are actually directly involved in the Syrian conflict. So, I mean, without a meaningful peace process in Syria, I think it's very difficult to envisage what kind of other solutions can be found. There are some ideas on the table. A lot of people are kind of advocating on behalf of what they call safe and legal routes into Europe, so that people don't have to make difficult and dangerous journeys as they're doing at the moment. I think that's an idea that's worth exploring, but I think the number of people who will be offered safe and legal routes will always be much, much smaller than the number of people who want to make their way to Europe, so there'll be a kind of frustrated demand there. And then I think the third area where we really have to look is something we've mentioned already, which is greater and different types of support to refugee hosting countries. And here I'm not just talking about higher levels of humanitarian assistance. You know, I don't think if you give a Syrian refugee a better tent or a little bit more food is going to change their whole outlook in life. I mean, I think if they're going to stay in those countries of asylum, such as Turkey, they really need to see much more of a future for themselves and their families, and that future has got to include things like access to employment and access to education. In the recent, I think James may want to say more on this, I think he's been following it, but in the recent EU-Turkey negotiations, I think Turkey has kind of made some offer to provide pathways to employment for Syrian refugees. I'm not exactly sure what that means, and I'm not exactly sure what kind of proportion of the Syrian refugees are going to be able to exercise the right to work. But I think unless they are given better employment opportunities, education opportunities, then the movement into Europe is certainly going to continue.
Yeah, I think that, you know, this is the absolutely foundation question, and I think there are no easy answers to this whatsoever. It was difficult enough before Russia got involved, and now that, you know, we have Russia, Iran, we have, I mean, so many players there, it's almost sort of becoming like a sort of competition to, you know, and more difficult, I think, to see a way forward. I mean, I think that if you're looking for some sort of degree of stability in Syria, it appears more and more that there's a very bitter pill to swallow, which may be that Assad is there for at least a foreseeable sort of future with some pathway out. And then what follows, well, I think is very unclear. I mean, James may well have some other ideas on that. But I think that one of the things that certainly the issue about safe and legal routes into the European Union, is important partly because what you're also trying to do at the moment, I think, is sort of calm the situation to some extent. That, you know, again, everybody is feeling that there is a rush on, that this is the once in a lifetime opportunity. For some it may well be. But, you know, so what else can be done to support those areas of stability that there are? I think there are real concerns about what is likely to happen in Lebanon unless real efforts are made to actually, you know, provide greater support on the ground there, not only for the refugees but for the Lebanese people themselves. I mean, what's the figure? Something like 1 in 4 people in Lebanon is estimated to be a refugee. So that's, you know, a tremendous, you know, I think a sort of responsibility, a tremendous burden that country is bearing. So some of the ideas that are beginning to come forward are linked to, yes, livelihood, purchasing power. You know, that what do you do about the daily allowances for people so that, you know, they actually have the opportunity to sort of, again, begin sort of, whether it's small businesses, you know, encourage markets, what can be done on the ground there in parts of Syria which may still sort of have some sort of stability with them in terms of agriculture, regeneration of the land, which again is becoming very, very degraded, and is going to be less and less possible, possibility of supporting people. So those sort of ideas about how do you actually help maintain stability in areas that still have some sort of stability. And certainly one of the things that, I mean, I made reference to Turkey earlier on. I'm trying to put this politely, but I think that the support that was given to Turkey in terms of dealing not only with ISIS but with the PKK was a really bad decision in terms of actually increasing instability in Turkey and not necessarily having any sort of coordinated force or strategy against ISIS. And therefore I think that in all of the dealings that the European Union now has with Turkey, that issue should not be set aside. That yes, obviously we've been trying for ages to get Turkey to keep its border pretty close towards Greece. All sorts of resources going into Turkey for that. But I think, we need to make sure that we're also looking at the peace process within Turkey amongst its own communities. But the right to work and that access for livelihood is extremely important wherever people are, whether it's within the European Union or in neighbouring countries.
I'd just like to quickly interject. In the geopolitical narrative, wouldn't it be right to engage with Russia? Isn't Russia the long-term key to this, given that negotiates with Assad, negotiates with Iran? Isn't that the key to de-escalating the situation in Syria and thereby decreasing the flow of migrants into Europe?
I think part of the discussion may be about whether it decreases flows of Syrians, but whether it increases flows of people from Ukraine. I think is one of the issues. And yes, I mean, people do feel that we need to be working with Russia. At the moment, I think it's not it's a pity that wasn't done much earlier in the crisis, when we couldn't find a solution with Russia earlier on. And therefore, things that have deteriorated and fragmented much more within Syria. I think one of the questions that certainly the European Union will be asking is what is the price of cooperating with Russia in terms of, lifting of sanctions, etc., because of the situation with Crimea and Ukraine.
I completely agree. Made very, very much more complicated by the Ukrainian situation, and that there remains a very powerful feeling that you can't in any way reward Russia for what it's done, for what it is still doing in eastern Ukraine and Crimea. I mean, you may be right that Russia has to be part of the solution, but it seems that the only solution that Russia is prepared to cooperate with is effectively enabling Assad to win the Syrian civil war. Now, realpolitik may mean that at the end of the day, we might, quietly go along with that, or at least not oppose it, because this has been this appalling a bloodbath for so many years. I'm not predicting that'll be the case, but certainly people are now talking from the US Secretary of State level down about a means in which Assad can stay in power for a transitional period. This feels to me like a move towards some sort of arrangement in which, and of course the key point is not Assad himself as an individual, but the clique around Assad. They're the ones who want to stay in power. No one's ever really believed that he was an individual strongman in the way that Saddam or Gaddafi was. And this man was an optician who was, on his father's death was taken as the symbol of the regime by the clique who had kept his father in power and are now keeping him in power. So the key thing there may be to keep the Alawites in power and that little coterie around Assad, rather than they may sacrifice the individual himself when the time comes. But I wouldn't be surprised if you saw more moves towards that. And I certainly think it's the only policy that Russia's going to go along with. Back in Europe, something is going to have to be done, because I think the public mood in Germany is turning quite fast. We are going to see a lull when, through the winter. Getting in those boats in the Mediterranean ceases to be possible on winter seas. And the numbers will fall very dramatically. And there will be a pause and there will be an opportunity. But if come the spring you start seeing 10,000 people a day coming into Germany again, I think you will find very real pressure on Merkel. There has already been a revival of the Pegida anti-Islamist marches in Dresden and Saxony, which we thought had gone away. They were largely discredited, but now the numbers are back up to 10,000–15,000 on a Monday night. And that's not to mention Austria, where the far right did extremely well at the weekend in elections in Vienna. France, we know what's happening in France with Marine Le Pen. It seems almost certain she will be one of the two runoff candidates for the presidential election in 2 years' time, and who knows, no one would rule out that she might win it. Immigration may be the issue that takes the UK out of the EU, I mean, these pressures are building up, and we have another couple of years of whatever the figures are, 5, 6, 7, 800,000 people arriving in Europe, and I think you will see those those pressures breaking out in a lot of very, very unfortunate ways. I suspect that the key to the issue is sorting out Syria, but even before you can do that, chucking money at the problem. It was estimated today that absorbing 800,000 refugees this year, if that's what the figure ends up being, is going to cost Germany between 20 and 30 billion euros. Well, they were talking last night about giving Turkey 3 billion. And as Angela Merkel pointed out, it is already costing the Turks 7 billion a year. So while this seems a lot of money to give to a not particularly pleasant regime, in fairness to them, they are hosting 2 million refugees and it's costing them a very significant amount of money. So if you have a situation in which Germany alone is paying 20 to 30 billion a year, I suspect that the EU is just going to have to bite the bullet and throw very significant sums of money at Turkey, at Jordan, at Lebanon, at Libya, in order to make life tolerable, acceptable, and for the people in camps or other forms of housing, and in order to persuade the governments there to cooperate in preventing wide-scale movement of people. I can't see any other short-term solution. Syrian war is not going to be over by next spring.
Perfect. Nothing. Yeah. Or something, Jeff.
No.
Great. So we'll open up to a Q&A session. We'll have 3 to 4 questions. Please do introduce yourself and ask and raise your voice when you speak. Anyone? Yes, William.
Well, it's just William Morris, Next Century Foundation. It's just disturbing to hear James saying that ITV treats all, in terms of its commentary, treats all migrants as refugees, and he's used the word refugee for migrants. We know that the queues at the Turkish Airways office in Baghdad go around the block, of young men looking for tickets to come to Istanbul and then to pay the people trafficker. It takes a lot of money to come to Europe that way. If you're a Yazidi refugee in poverty in northern Iraq in the middle of a plain, that's not an opportunity that's open to you. That's one issue, and the other issue is, of course, it's very disturbing, or at least I find it very disturbing, that though Al-Azhar and the Coptic Church are appealing to the West to stop the ethnic cleansing of Christians in the Middle East, the reverse ethnic cleansing, as we draw Christian migrants here and give them preferential treatment, A, because they're richer, and B, because when we get here, we give them preferential treatment. And the whole campaigns within the church for that now in the West, it's a disturbing this bias. So I'm disturbed by the way that we treat these things, and we have no refugees in the region. If a Yazidi, a lot of these real refugees don't want to leave, and they would like to have help in the region, but we're not building homes in the Nineveh Plain or supporting people there. I suspect we could do a lot more in the region.
Was there a question?
Yeah, well,
Can we do more in the region? Which I think of my last answer was just saying, yes, that's precisely. That's what I mean by chucking money at the problem. I don't mean just give them money, but I mean, you're going to spend it properly and wisely in order to do that. There are, I have to say, listen, I may have been on the road for many weeks, but in terms of the numbers of people there, I met remarkably few of them, but I did meet several Yazidi families, and there's no question that some Yazidis have been able to get out. And indeed the Yazidis were horribly treated, but were not necessarily horribly poor. Many of them lived quite middle-class lives in northern Iraq, in relatively speaking, prosperous towns before ISIS turned up, and certainly when they scrape together everything they have, it's enough to pay the people traffickers in many cases. In terms of how we describe them, it's a complete minefield. You cannot say every single time refugees and or economic migrants. You can't decide whether they're refugees or whether they're migrants. So as I explained my policy, and I think it's fairly common in ITV, you point out that amongst these people there are going to be refugees and economic migrants, but that they do have the right to be treated as refugees until, if they say they are, until otherwise established. That's simply the way, that's why we've lent towards using the term refugees rather than calling them all migrants all the time. Whilst absolutely accepting that in amongst them are economic migrants. I mean, I met a gentleman from Lahore who, when I said, "Why have you come?" Lahore in Pakistan, he said, "Well, the electricity didn't work and I didn't have a job." You know, not for me to say that's not a very good reason to try and get into Europe. It may not, when he meets the asylum officer and has his claim examined, be as convincing or compelling a reason as some of the others I met. But that was the reason he said that he had left. You know, I am not about to judge him or why he's left or whether he should be given. That's for people who paid, I would say higher pay grade, but maybe not even that actually.
Any more questions? Yes.
Hello, I'm Seifu. In terms of the solution, Syria is always mentioned, but there's one country that's quite forgotten, and that's Libya. Libya is a failed state, and a large portion of this movement comes from Libya to cross the Mediterranean. Obviously, the intervention by NATO in Libya sort of caused this instability as bad as Gaddafi was. It was a British and French-led intervention. I mean, Syria is a minefield. It's been the arena of the great powers for a long time. But Libya, it's a more solvable situation. There could be a lot more that could be done to create a safer area there, to create a political settlement. So should more focus be put on Libya as something that can be worked on? Because Syria, I don't think will get better anytime soon. Thank you.
Do you want to go at it, Jeff, or Jean? Or James?
I think Jeff's your man,
Yeah, I'm not a close student of the Libyan situation, Libyan politics. Clearly, the movement across the Mediterranean took place as a result of the collapse of the Libyan state post-Gaddafi, and I don't think that was thought through very clearly by the powers that were involved in deposing Gaddafi. I think the whole Libyan situation has actually gone out of focus a little bit over the last couple of weeks, simply because the migratory route through the Balkans has become so much more dominant. But in terms of addressing the whole question of human smuggling and people coming across the Mediterranean, then clearly the disarray that exists within Libya has clearly facilitated that movement of people.
So can I pick up on that? Yeah, I mean, just checking the statement from the Communication Commission this week, and certainly, I mean, there is still an interest in Libya from the European Union. Part of it that people may well be aware of has been the move to actually try and disrupt the smuggling by even looking at permission to take out the, any potential boat, etc., in the area, and to deal sort of in the territory with, with those dealing with that. But there's certainly ongoing efforts to try and actually get some sort of political agreement, some sort of political discussion, and certainly that there were proposals on the table, I think even this week. Trying to bring various sort of parties together to actually try and find at least, a ceasefire, a way forward, etc., which have not borne fruit. And I've got colleagues who've been in Libya very recently who say that, and it's quite depressing to hear, but from what they were hearing from the various sort of parties in the sense that they were dealing with, there is almost no real desire on the ground to actually come to necessarily a political conclusion in this. That, because people feel that they're going on to win. And that, that was one of the strands coming through. So it's another ongoing problem. But you're right, it's not only Syria. And what's happening along sort of North Africa certainly also needs investment of time and energy to actually try and find some sort of stability and way forward there.
maybe I'll just say a word about the operation that you just mentioned. On the 7th of October, the EU started an operation called Operation Sophia, the purpose of which, if I've got the language right, is to identify, seize, divert and destroy boats carrying irregular migrants and refugees, whatever we like to call them. And to me, this is just an expensive public relations stunt and waste of money, because the smugglers don't travel on the boats. So you can intercept these boats, but you'll probably find some poor refugee with who's been given the GPS to steer the boat with. You're not going to get the kingpins of the smuggling movement by intercepting the boat. So it seems to me like and boats are destroyed anyway. Once they land, the boats are destroyed. So I don't really see what the advantage to be gained from this operation is. If any of you are looking for an interesting dissertation topic to write, you might want to look at the way that you might want to look at the way that the European Union, led in many ways by the UK, have managed to get the UN Security Council Chapter 7 resolution to legitimise this operation. Chapter 7 resolutions are intended to counter threats to international peace and security. You might want to ask the question as to whether, even in the numbers that there have been coming refugees coming on boats from Libya, really do represent a threat to peace and security in Europe.
We'll open up to another question. The girl in the green shirt.
Hi, I'm Ida Les, I'm 23, I'm studying Masters of Pure Mathematics. Thank you for your time, your answer already. Thank you, Student Think Tank, for hosting this. I was quite disappointed when I walked in, when I saw them sitting next to each other, because I was expecting a debate, and they're agreeing and nodding with each other quite often, and most of the time. And I'm missing one point completely, and I hope you will debate a bit about it. I'm missing the added value refugees, the value refugees could add to society. You were mentioning that it costs lots of money, but it might pay back.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's absolutely no question about that, and there's even conspiracy theories in France that quite respectable ones or from respectable people, I might rephrase that, that Angela Merkel has actually done this as a way to bring in cheap labour and to sort out the country's pension problems by bringing in what are often middle class, educated, English-speaking, university-level people to rejuvenate a German economy which has been suffering terribly from ageing and a falling workforce. I mean, this is undoubtedly true. It does not affect the short-term problem of assimilation and of people and of a feeling in a functioning democracy that they're being overwhelmed by people. I mean, one of the towns I was in, Stetten, which is a former German army base, now disused, has been converted to a refugee base. It's centre. It's intended to accommodate 1,000 people. It has 3,500 people in it, with a further 100 arriving every day. The town of Stetten has a population of 5,000. Now, of course, it's in the town. It's not a locked, closed prison by any means. The gates are open. They can come and go as they like. And the net result of the town of Stetten is now 50% Syrian or Afghan. Now, it's all completely peaceful. There doesn't seem to be any obvious problem with it, but the people of the town look around them and say, you know, is this our future? And if it is, we don't want it. We don't want it like this. We don't want it this fast. So there is a very real short-term problem of how do you accommodate, educate, give hospital beds to, assign GPs to, and just build enough houses for what may turn out to be in excess of 1 million people. But there is no question that further down the line it may turn out to economically prove extremely beneficial. But I think there is a fair recognition of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It's one that I'm really torn about, to be honest. The organisation I used to work for, UNHCR, has quite a well-known T-shirt, and the slogan on the T-shirt is "Einstein was a refugee." And when I see that T-shirt, which I don't particularly like, I always read into it that it's sending out the message, if you're taking 100,000 refugees, you might be lucky enough to get one Einstein. And let's face it, most refugees aren't Einsteins. They may have skills, qualities, education, but they're not Einsteins. So, I think it's a slippery slope when you start arguing for refugee admissions on the basis of the skills that they bring with them. Because, what about the elderly, what about the disabled, what about the uneducated? So I think it's a slippery slope to start arguing that we bring in refugees because they have something that they can give to us, rather than more the humanitarian imperative, which was the basis of international refugee law.
I'll open up to the back there. Yes, that guy with glasses.
I got mine.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm George. I'm the editor actually of the think tank. My question is, in light of the fact that in the future we're going to be dealing with climate wars and refugees because of climate change, do you not think as a European body we might better spend our time, rather than kind of massaging people by saying, this is fine, it's only until we sort out Syria, we might actually be better off saying that in the long term we're just going to have to get used to lots of refugees, and actually we need to have a long-term solution to it, rather than just saying it'll be fine when Syria is over.
You're the politician, Jenny.
No. Your comment.
Okay. I don't think it's alternatives, and I think that that one of the things about issues about sort of displacement of peoples linked to climate change is that part of that may well be Europeans going elsewhere, and I think that to look at you'll have to look at that globally, just as in many respects you have to in the whole sort of question of refugees as well, because as we know, not all refugees by any manner of means come to the European Union. So I think we need at times to sort of look again at this with a global focus rather than a sort of Eurocentric focus. But I mean, it's certainly true that all the sort of the estimates are that you're going to see an increasing number of people moving because of climate change. Not all of those will go cross-border. The research that the European Union has done so far tells you that most people will simply move within their country, as more or less happens now. That and it becomes very difficult at times as well to define exactly why it is that people have moved. So while it's also a question of climate change, it's also an issue about governance, it's an issue about adaptation. But it doesn't mean that you can take your eye off the ball on climate. That certainly, if we're looking at Syria, there are voices, people saying now, well, look at the background of drought, which also, and how did the government handle that? Very badly. So therefore, you already had a creation of a greater instability on the ground, which makes people react in ways that they might otherwise not have done. So it's part of the contribution to increasing instability. Therefore, it needs to be taken extremely seriously for a whole set of reasons. But a lot of those reasons are not to do with displacement. And I've spent quite a lot of time working with organisations that work on development, work on environment, as well as all refugee organisations that work with refugees, to try and make sure that we don't keep talking about avalanches, as it were, of climate change refugees coming at us. Because a lot of the time what that does is make it much more difficult for people to actually deal with the refugee situation that we have. It becomes frightening, it becomes, it's difficult enough now, but the idea that, look, if we don't do something, oh my God, I think actually really doesn't help us necessarily deal with climate change. You have to look at it, yes, it's important, people will move, it makes life increasingly difficult, but I think we need to be very careful about linking it with this idea that there are going to be, in the usual words, sort of floods, tsunamis, they're usually water words, aren't they? Of people moving. Because it doesn't necessarily get you the reactions that you want in order to actually solve the problems that you have.
Can I just ask the audience, anybody studying law here? Okay, I'm going to be very generous and give you another dissertation topic. So the question is, Should international refugee law be expanded to include people displaced by climate change and natural disasters? There's already quite a literature on it, but it's quite an interesting thing you might want to think about studying.
If you don't have time to write that down, you can definitely check on the YouTube account that we have for the think tank. Yeah. I saw that Veronica had a question.
Yeah, I just
the lady in the front. I'll just
Veronica Morris, Next Century Foundation. I just have a question that why do you have to move all these people? They're very happy where they are. If you could find a safe haven that they could go to in their own country, you wouldn't have to move them. I mean, you see these are desperate. They would like to stay in their own countries. Why move them to what other countries they don't want to go to? Why not keep them where they are and get a little safe haven in the area, UCD area? And why not spend money on getting a safe little spot that they can stay in safely in their own country?
James, Jeff.
I mean, I suspect the reason is that people aren't moving them, they're moving them themselves and paying a great deal of money to do it. But what you say is absolutely right about making them feel safe where they are. And it may be right that a lot of them want to stay there. It's certainly not, I don't think, right that all of them do, particularly in the circumstances of what's happened.
I think a lot of them do want to stay.
But creating safety and a degree of physical comfort and ensuring that proper food, supplies and accommodation is obviously vital, but I don't think anybody's moving them. They are moving themselves.
I mean, in the early and mid-1990s, there was a lot of thought given to the whole notion of safe havens in countries of origin, countries that are affected by armed conflict and human rights violations, and there were some efforts in northern Iraq, in the Balkans and in Sri Lanka indeed to try and establish such safe havens. I mean, the fact of the matter is that if you're trying to create a safe haven in a war-torn country, you can only do it with the use of military force. And I don't think, people may want to live in their own country, but do they want to live in a highly militarised situation where they're dependent on the armed forces of another country to provide them with some basic level of protection? Sorry, it's gone off.
We've got Erica coming, so we'll be fine. Are there any other questions that I can open up to? Yep, Erica, can you please just speak up though?
My name's Alex. I'm a first year student at King's. My question is for Jean Lambert. You spoke a bit about Theresa May saying that there's pressure on social cohesion in Britain. What do you think, as a member for London, about that, and what do you think it says, if anything at all, about Britain?
Okay, apparently the mic has given out at that point, so I reserve the right not to answer. I think in terms of the issue about social cohesion, it doesn't necessarily happen by accident, and that that I think if you look back over sort of London's, certainly since the last, well, some of you will be even before your lifetimes, that a lot of people tend to think of London as somewhere which is relatively socially cohesive, in the sense that you don't necessarily have sort of particular ghettos like you have in some parts of the world, that you don't necessarily see people as you would in Paris being sort of stuck out in the banlieue in order to keep people out of the way. Societies generally, most of the time, get along reasonably well. That's not an accident. That's because one hell of a lot of work actually went into that, and in many respects is still going on in those senses, about how you bring communities together, how people actually learn to learn about each other. And I think one of the big mistakes we've made in this country was that this feeling that that sort of effort was only needed in places where actually you had communities from different countries, different backgrounds, different faiths, and we didn't actually put that work in sort of 20 miles down the road from where I now live and where I was brought up, in Essex, which is a different country in many respects. And so and it's not the only place like that. So I think that if we're looking at bringing more people in whether it's through resettlement, whether it's through the relocation schemes, whatever else it is, that the efforts that also have to go on with that are about sort of explaining and bringing people together so that people do work as communities, and so that you're being very careful about explaining why people are here, why they have the assistance that they have, that, you know, that asylum seekers are not work shy, asylum seekers are not allowed to work, you know, so that people actually understand what's going on. And a while back the European Union ran a programme called Equal, which was, you know, one of the pilot projects that they do, with a whole set of pilot projects going on in different countries, different places, and it had a strand for asylum seekers within it. And one of the very strong lessons that came out of that was that if you're looking at integration, it starts at day one for asylum seekers, and it starts the day before, as it were, for the communities that they are coming to. And I think this is one of the things that the European Union has really got to get its heads round with this, because exactly as James was saying, the sort of resistance that you're seeing is in large part with people thinking, what the hell is going on here? Nobody asked me, nobody's talking to me. And yet we also see that there's a lot of civil society that really wants to be engaged. Look at the number of people who are saying, I've got a spare room. I mean, they obviously weren't living in social housing and losing housing benefit over it. But, you know, I've got a spare room. I'm willing to help. You look at what was happening sort of within faith communities who were not saying, I'm only taking somebody who comes in wearing a cross. You know, that effort is there. It can be harnessed. And I think that one of the things that governments need to do, and indeed, you know, not just governments, but throughout society, is actually do that. To harness that goodwill and to actually try and find some sort of grounding which also provides a response to the Marine Le Pens and others at this point, who I hear far too much of in the European Parliament. Well, I mean, you know, she's not there that often, but when she is, she speaks far too much from my point of view.
So we have time. We have time for one more question. Yes, the gentleman in the back. Just raise your voice.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. Okay. On regard, my question is, what will and should you think happen after these wars are over in Syria and in Ukraine, where people can return safely to their homes and they can live there? And what's going to happen as they establish the state between the countries that they sort of asylum to? What's going to happen after the wars are over and now it's safe to come back? Or just going to send them back by using force, or are they going to stay there where they established their routines?
Let me tell you, a number of people that I've spoken to, and I almost always in the course of conversation say, what are your hopes here? Are you here forever, or do you want to go back? And I would say around about half say, no, absolutely, we want to go back, we love our country, that's where we want to be. The other half say, no, we've got out, we're staying out. So I think with a large number of them, there won't be any issue of forcing them back. And quite often you do find, you saw that in Lebanon after the fighting, 15-year civil war there finally came to an end in the early 80s, and a lot of the diaspora went back and helped rebuild the country, saw it as an opportunity, but anyway, it was their home. And in terms of when the war is over, I cannot see that part of the Middle East being rebuilt on the basis of borders that were drawn up largely by the British in the early 1920s. I think the sectarian and ethnic divide there now between Sunni and Shia and Kurds, among others, are now probably too great to ever put countries like in Iraq and Syria back together again. But that's an extremely off-the-record, unofficial view of mine that I hope you won't put out on Twitter, because there's an ITV view and it's not.
Yeah. I mean, there's a kind of a mantra amongst humanitarian organisations that the only thing a refugee wants to do is to go back to their home. And as James has said, that's not necessarily the case. And my suspicion, particularly in the case of Syria, is that the proportion not wanting to go home will be relatively large compared to other refugee situations, partly because of the traumatic experiences they've gone through before flight, but also because of the sheer level of devastation. And we were all talking a few minutes ago about the possibility of a future with Syria with Assad still in power. I mean, how is Assad going to mobilise any kind of reconstruction funding from the international community? I just don't see it.
Interestingly different, Jeff. Once they have a passport, a European passport, the willingness to go back in the certain knowledge that you can always get out again is great.
I've always said to this Home Office, if you want refugees to go home, give them a British passport. That's the quickest way you can to go home, because they've got an escape route if anything goes wrong once they've gone back home. But I think it's going to be very interesting and maybe somewhat depressing to see what happens if some kind of more peaceful situation emerges in Syria, to see whether people go back, and if they do go back, what kind of support they're going to go back to.
Well, I've been asked to make an announcement about the upcoming King's Think Tank relaunch event. This is kind of a teaser event for you to know what our discussions are going to be like and what to foresee. The relaunch event is on Monday. Lord Paddy Ashdown is coming. We welcome everyone to come. On Tuesday. And we also have an announcement from Sophia concerning the Spectrum, which is our journal that we publish in. So go ahead.
Hi everyone, my name is Sophia. I am one of the European Affairs editors for the Spectrum, which is the think tank's journal. I'll make it nice and brief. We're basically looking for people to write for the Spectrum. It's possibly like a policy recommendation. We cover a mirage of issues from defence and diplomacy to energy and the environment. So if you're willing to write for us, if you want to write for us, do not hesitate to contact any of us, me or any of the other editors, and we're around, or you can send us an email. We look forward to hearing from you. Thanks.
Thank you. So can we get a round of applause for... Thank you so much for coming. We hope to see you in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.